Rachel Harper had never seen the library as just a job. It was her sanctuary, a place where she could lose herself among the rows of dusty shelves and words that could transport her to another world. Growing up in foster care, Rachel had learned early that family wasn't always permanent, and love wasn't always unconditional. But books offered her a different kind of refuge. They gave her warmth in a cold world, a sense of belonging that she had never truly experienced. By day, Rachel worked as a part-time library assistant in a small but quiet public library nestled in the heart of the city. When she wasn't shelving books or helping visitors find their next great read, she spent hours combing through the pages of novels, letting her imagination run wild. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It helped her forget about the struggles she faced daily, working long hours to make rent, picking up odd babysitting jobs to fill the gaps. Rachel was used to it all. She had been doing it for years and had never complained. Life wasn't about getting everything you wanted. It was about doing what you could with what you had. On one rainy afternoon, as the storm outside cast a dim light over the library's interior, Rachel was restocking a section of fairy tales. The quiet of the library was broken only by the rhythmic tap of raindrops against the windows and the occasional shuffle of feet. As she reached for a book on the highest shelf, her eyes caught sight of a small figure near the window. He was sitting alone, his body hunched over a book that rested in his lap. His wheelchair was positioned slightly out of reach of the nearest shelf, and his eyes were barely visible behind the cover of a storybook. There was something about the way he sat there, so still, so solitary, that tugged at Rachel's heart. She couldn't help but watch him for a few moments, wondering why he seemed so lonely. Most of the children who came into the library were excited to pick out their favorite stories, but this boy appeared different. He seemed as though he had been sitting there for a long time, waiting for something, or perhaps for someone. Rachel shook herself out of her thoughts and returned to her work. But no matter how hard she tried to focus on the task at hand, she found herself glancing back at the boy every few minutes. There was a subtle sadness in his posture, a quiet loneliness that radiated from him. She noticed how his small hands reached for the shelf, stretching as far as they could, but he couldn't quite reach the book he wanted. It was just beyond his grasp. Her heart tightened at the sight. Without giving it a second thought, she made her way toward him, her footsteps barely making a sound on the carpeted floor. "Need some help?" Rachel asked softly, her voice breaking the silence. The boy startled slightly at the sound of her voice. His wide eyes, a brilliant shade of blue, met hers. For a moment, he just stared at her, his gaze unblinking, as if he couldn't quite believe someone was talking to him. There was a distant, almost guarded look in his eyes. But he didn't speak. Instead, he just nodded slightly, still holding onto the book with both hands, as though afraid to let it go. Rachel smiled gently, trying to ease his unease. "Don't worry, I can help you reach it," she said, and without waiting for him to respond, she carefully pulled the book from the shelf. She handed it to him, and he hesitated for a moment before taking it from her with a delicate touch. As he looked down at the book in his hands, his fingers traced the title, "The Brave Knight and the Starlit Queen." Rachel noticed how carefully he held the book, almost as if it were the most precious thing in the world to him. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper. "I like this one," he said, his words soft, like a secret shared only with the pages of the book. Rachel crouched down to meet his eye level, her heart swelling with empathy. "It's a great story," she said warmly. "Have you read it before?" The boy nodded slowly, his gaze drifting back to the cover. "A long time ago," he murmured. There was something in his voice, something that made Rachel pause. She could see the faint sadness in his expression, a longing that went beyond the pages of the book. Without thinking, Rachel asked, "Would you like me to read it to you?" For a long moment, the boy didn't answer. He just stared at the book, as if unsure what to say. Then, slowly, he looked up at her again, his blue eyes wide with surprise. "You would?" he asked, his voice filled with quiet wonder. Rachel smiled gently. "Of course," she said. "I'd be happy to." There was a brief silence before the boy nodded, and Rachel pulled out a chair next to him. She sat down, opening the book to the first page, her voice soft but animated as she began to read. As she read the story, she used different voices for the characters, bringing them to life. The boy listened intently, his eyes lighting up with each new voice and turn of the page. For the first time, Rachel heard the boy laugh. It was a soft, almost shy sound, but it was real. And it made Rachel's heart swell with warmth. She had no idea that someone was watching them. Victor Matthews, the boy's father, who had been observing the scene from his office through the library's security cameras. At first, he hadn't thought much of it, just another kind stranger helping his son. But as he watched, he began to notice something different in the way Rachel interacted with Luke. She wasn't just being polite. She was genuinely engaged, truly present. Victor's curiosity was piqued. He had seen his son, Luke, struggle with loneliness for years, and he had never seen him laugh like that before. Something about Rachel made his son happy, and for the first time in a long time, Victor felt something stir inside him. As Rachel continued reading, she had no idea that this simple act of kindness was about to change her life forever. She had no idea that Luke's father, the man who had everything money could buy, would soon find himself drawn to her not because of her job, not because of her circumstances, but because of the way she made his son feel, like he mattered. The following day, Rachel arrived at the library like she always did, her mind already swirling with the thoughts of the books she would be shelving, and the quiet hum of the place she had come to call her second home. Yet, as she walked into the children's section, something felt different. There, sitting by the same window, was the same boy, Luke Fisher. His wheelchair was positioned exactly where it had been the day before, and as his bright blue eyes flickered up from the book in his lap, their gazes met again. The memory of his soft laugh from yesterday lingered in Rachel's mind, and for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she felt drawn to him even more. It was as though their brief interaction had sparked something between them, a connection that was fragile yet real. But this time, Rachel hesitated. What if he didn't want to see her again? What if it had just been a one-time thing? But before she could second-guess herself, Luke's eyes locked onto hers, and a small, tentative smile spread across his face. Without saying a word, he shifted slightly, and his hands rested on the book in his lap. Rachel's heart fluttered at the unspoken invitation, and she found herself walking over to him without a moment's hesitation. "Hey there," Rachel said gently, crouching down so that they were eye to eye. She didn't want to overwhelm him. She didn't want to push too hard. But she could see the same sadness in his eyes, the same quiet loneliness that she had noticed the day before. "Do you want me to read to you again?" she asked, her voice soft. Luke's face lit up with surprise, as though he hadn't expected her to return so soon. "You'll read to me?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Of course," Rachel replied with a warm smile. "It's my favorite thing to do." And just like that, our routine began. Every afternoon, Luke would wait for Rachel to arrive. He would sit in his spot, his eyes glued to the door as though he knew she was coming. Rachel had never been so eager to start her shift. The moments they shared in the library became the highlights of her days, and slowly she began to learn more about him. Luke spoke in quiet, shy sentences, but when he did, it was as if he was offering a piece of his soul. At first he only spoke about the books he loved, the adventures of knights, pirates, and dragons, stories that transported him far from the confines of his wheelchair. But as the days passed, the conversations began to flow more naturally. Luke started to tell Rachel about his mother, the woman who had read him those very stories before she passed away. His voice would tremble when he spoke of her, and Rachel could see the pain that still lingered behind his words. "She used to read this one to me," Luke said one afternoon, holding up a well-worn book. "We'd read it together every night before bed. I miss her." Rachel's heart clenched. She could see how much his mother had meant to him, how deeply he still felt the loss. But there was something else too, something in the way Luke spoke about his mother that made Rachel understand the depth of his love for her. It wasn't just a child's attachment to a parent. It was a bond that stretched beyond life and death, one that could never be severed. "I'm really sorry, Luke," Rachel said softly, her voice trembling with empathy. "I know how hard it must be." Luke nodded, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he turned his gaze back to the book in his hands. It was a simple act, but in that moment, Rachel realized that their bond wasn't just built on stories and fairy tales. It was built on something much deeper. It was the quiet understanding that they were both searching for something. Rachel had never known what it was like to belong, to have a family that would never leave her. Luke, on the other hand, had lost that sense of family long before his mother passed away. Together, they created a new kind of family, a small, fragile thread connecting them in the midst of their loneliness. As they spent more time together, Rachel noticed subtle changes in Luke. He began to laugh more, his eyes lighting up whenever she did different voices for the characters in the stories they read. He would offer small bits of his own imagination, sharing stories of what he thought would happen if he were the knight or the hero in the tale. It was in these moments that Rachel saw the true magic of what they were building together, not just a friendship, but a sanctuary from the world outside. One day, as Rachel was reading about a daring knight who sailed across dangerous seas, Luke's voice interrupted her. "You know, I want to be like him," he said, his eyes serious as he looked up at her. "I want to go on an adventure." Rachel paused, closing the book and turning to face him. "You can be anything you want to be, Luke," she said softly. "Being a hero isn't about what your legs can do. It's about what's in your heart." Luke looked up at her, his eyes wide with wonder. "Really? Really?" Rachel affirmed, smiling gently. "Every great hero starts small. And maybe one day you'll sail across the world." Luke's eyes shifted, the doubt still present, but there was a glimmer of hope. "Maybe," he whispered, running his fingers over the pages of his book. It was moments like these, small, yet significant, that showed Rachel just how powerful their connection had become. To Rachel, Luke was no longer just a boy in a wheelchair. He was a young man with dreams, hopes, and a world of potential waiting to unfold. And to Luke, Rachel was more than just the librarian who read to him. She was someone who saw him for who he was, someone who didn't pity him, someone who made him believe in the impossible. What neither of them knew, however, was that their growing bond had not gone unnoticed. As the days passed, someone else was watching, the one person who had the power to change everything. Luke's father, Victor Matthews. Victor had always been busy with his empire, consumed by his work and the demands of his business. But as he watched the interactions between Rachel and his son through the library's security footage, he couldn't help but feel something stir inside him. There was something special about the way Rachel treated Luke, something genuine and unspoken. Victor had never seen his son so alive, so happy, and for the first time in years, he found himself wondering what it would be like to have someone like Rachel in their lives. As the days slipped into weeks, the library began to feel like a second home for Rachel. She had always found comfort in the quiet corners of the building, surrounded by the smell of old pages and the hum of distant voices. But now, there was something different. It wasn't just the books that drew her in anymore. It was the anticipation of seeing Luke. Every afternoon, like clockwork, Luke would be waiting for her in his usual spot, his wheelchair positioned just close enough to the shelf, as if it was his quiet way of hoping she would come. Rachel had noticed subtle changes in Luke. He was more animated, his once cautious eyes now filled with light as he laughed at her attempts to do different voices for the characters in their stories. He no longer seemed like a boy resigned to the shadows of his wheelchair. Instead, he was starting to blossom, his imagination reaching beyond the limitations his body imposed. And Rachel, in turn, was changing too. She had never imagined that a boy she barely knew could make her feel so important, so needed. Yet, there was an undercurrent of uncertainty that still lingered in her heart. She could feel herself growing closer to Luke, And with that closeness came a sense of responsibility, a feeling that she was becoming more than just someone who read to him. He was relying on her, not just for stories, but for something deeper. And what was she offering in return? A piece of her own heart, a connection she had longed for, but never truly had. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the library windows as Rachel adjusted the bookshelves, her thoughts wandering as they often did. But today, as she walked into the children's section, something caught her off guard. Luke was sitting in his usual spot, but this time there was an unfamiliar presence in the room. Standing near the entrance, a tall man with an imposing stature was watching her. His sharp, businesslike demeanor immediately struck her as out of place in the cozy, quiet library. For a moment, their eyes met, and Rachel felt a chill run down her spine. She recognized him immediately, Victor Matthews, the CEO of a successful tech conglomerate, and, as she had recently learned, Luke's father. He was the last person she expected to see here. She didn't know why, but the air suddenly felt thick with the weight of his gaze. "Excuse me," Victor's voice was low and controlled, yet there was a firmness to it that made her feel uneasy. "You're the one who's been reading to my son." Rachel swallowed, her nerves getting the better of her. Yes, I've been reading to him," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "Luke enjoys books, and I'm happy to help." Victor's eyes softened ever so slightly, but there was still a guarded look in his expression. "I've seen you here for quite some time now, spending a lot of time with Luke. I wanted to know why." Rachel was taken aback by his directness, but she quickly recovered. "I just want to help him," she said, her words honest and simple. "I know what it's like to feel alone, and I thought that maybe, just maybe, I could make a difference for him. He's a bright kid. He deserves that." There was a brief silence between them, and Rachel could feel the weight of Victor's scrutiny. He wasn't the kind of man who showed vulnerability, and Rachel knew better than to expect anything less than a corporate, calculated response. Yet there was something in the way he looked at her, something that made her wonder if he was beginning to see her not just as a stranger, but as someone who was making a difference in his son's life. Victor exhaled slowly, his sharp features relaxing slightly. "I'll admit, I didn't expect you to make such an impact on him," he said, his tone softening. "Luke hasn't laughed like that in a long time. I don't think I've ever seen him so animated." Rachel nodded, feeling a flicker of warmth at his words. She had always been used to people underestimating her quiet life, her humble job, the way she had never quite fit into the polished world around her. But here, with Luke, she was different. Here, she mattered. "Thank you," Victor added, his voice quieter now, "for being there for him." Rachel smiled, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. "It's nothing. I'm just happy to see him happy." Victor paused for a moment, as if considering something. "I've been busy," he admitted, a rare vulnerability creeping into his voice. "I haven't been the father I should have been. I didn't know how to connect with him after his mother passed away. I threw myself into work, thinking that would fix everything. But it didn't. I wasn't there for him the way he needed." Rachel's heart softened at his admission. She had never expected to hear such honesty from a man like Victor Matthews. She had always imagined him as distant, a man who viewed the world through the lens of power and business. But now, she saw something different, a father who was struggling, just like she had. A father who, despite his wealth, hadn't figured out how to heal the wounds his son carried. "I'm sorry," Rachel said, her voice gentle. "It's not easy, I know. But Luke's still a kid, and he needs you. More than anything, he needs you to be there for him." Victor looked at her with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "I don't know if I can be the father he needs," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent so long building this empire, I forgot how to build a family." Rachel was silent for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to settle between them. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady. "It's never too late. You can still be the father he deserves." For the first time in a long while, Victor's expression softened, and something flickered in his eyes. Hope, maybe, or the possibility of change. He turned to leave, but not before looking back at Rachel. "Thank you," he said again, his voice full of sincerity, "for giving me hope." As the door closed behind him, Rachel stood there for a moment, her heart heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. She had never expected this conversation to go the way it had, but in some strange way, it had opened a new door, not just for Luke, but for Victor as well. She had seen a side of him that few people had ever witnessed, a side that was raw and vulnerable. And as Rachel returned to her work, her mind buzzed with the possibilities of what lay ahead. She had come into Luke's life to offer him something: kindness, companionship, a small escape from his pain. But now she realized she had opened the door to a new world, one that was more complex and more uncertain than she had ever imagined. But one thing was certain: she was no longer just reading books to Luke. She was becoming a part of his story, and in doing so, she was changing her own. Rachel had never imagined that her life would change because of a boy in a wheelchair and his distant, wealthy father. But here she was, standing in the vast, opulent foyer of Victor Matthews' mansion, feeling like a fish out of water. The marble floors, the towering columns, the sleek, polished furniture. It all felt too grand, too foreign. She had always been accustomed to a small, modest apartment and the quiet comfort of the library. But now, standing before the gates of Victor's world, she felt like an outsider. The invitation had arrived 2 days ago, an expensive envelope embossed with gold lettering. At first, Rachel thought it had been a mistake. Why would someone like Victor Matthews invite someone like her to his home? But when she saw the name at the bottom of the letter, Victor Matthews, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire, her heart skipped a beat. She had no idea what he wanted from her, but she knew she couldn't refuse, not with Luke involved. If this was about him, she had to go. As the butler opened the door and led her inside, Rachel felt a knot form in her stomach. The mansion was unlike anything she had ever seen. The chandeliers sparkled like 1,000 stars, casting soft, golden light over everything. The walls were adorned with paintings and sculptures that spoke of wealth and status, things Rachel had never thought much about. Her simple black dress seemed out of place here, but she walked on, her step steady, even though her heart was racing. Victor stood at the center of the room when she entered, looking every bit the businessman he was, even in casual attire. A crisp dress shirt and dark trousers. He exuded authority. His presence was commanding, and Rachel couldn't help but feel like she was under a microscope. He had always been an enigma to her, someone who was far removed from the life she led. And now, standing in his world, she realized just how different their lives were. "Rachel," Victor said, his voice smooth and controlled. He gave her a small nod, but his gaze was sharp, studying her as if she were some kind of puzzle he was trying to solve. "I appreciate you coming." Rachel forced a smile, feeling a sense of unease settle in her chest. "Of course," she replied, her voice sounding smaller than she intended. "Thank you for inviting me." "Please, sit." Victor gestured toward the luxurious sofa beside him. The room was silent, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning. Rachel took a seat, trying not to fidget under his gaze. For a moment, they just looked at each other, an unspoken tension hanging in the air. Finally, Victor broke the silence. "I wanted to talk to you about Luke," he said, his voice steady, but with a hint of something deeper underneath. "I've noticed you've had a significant impact on him. I don't think I've ever seen him this happy." Rachel's heart softened at his words. Victor didn't speak much about his son, and she had always sensed a distance between them. But now, here he was, acknowledging the change she had unknowingly brought to his life. "I'm just doing what anyone would do," Rachel said, shrugging slightly. "He's a great kid. He deserves to feel like he belongs." Victor looked at her with something resembling admiration. "I've spent my entire life building an empire," he said quietly, his tone taking on a reflective edge. "But I've neglected the most important thing. My son. I've been too caught up in my own world, and I didn't realize how badly Luke needed me." Rachel's heart went out to him. She had never expected Victor to open up like this. She had always seen him as a man who had everything: money, power, influence. But here, in his own home, he seemed just as lost as anyone else. The realization hit her hard. No amount of money or status could fill the void he felt as a father. "I've made a lot of mistakes," Victor continued, his voice heavy. "But I want to make things right, for him, and for you. I don't think you realize what you've done for Luke, what you've given him." Rachel blinked, surprised by the depth of his words. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," she said softly. "I just spent time with him, listened to him." "That's exactly it," Victor replied, his eyes locking onto hers. "You've given him something I couldn't. Genuine love, care, attention. You've shown him that he matters, that he's not defined by his disability." Rachel felt a rush of emotion, but she didn't know what to say. She had never expected this kind of acknowledgement. She had simply been herself, giving Luke what she could. But in doing so, she had touched something in Victor, something he had long neglected. "I know this might seem sudden," Victor said, his voice taking on a more urgent tone, "but I want you to be a part of Luke's life. And mine. I'm offering you a position at my company, a chance to step into a world where you don't have to struggle anymore." Rachel's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. Not at all. A job offer from Victor Matthews. It sounded too good to be true, but there was a catch, something she couldn't ignore. She wasn't just being offered a job. She was being asked to enter his world of wealth, power, and business. "I'm not sure," she said quietly, her mind racing. "I've spent my life working to make ends meet. But this is a different world, Victor. I don't know if I belong there." Victor leaned forward slightly, his eyes intense. "You belong with Luke," he said, his voice softer now. "And that's all that matters. I'm not asking you to change who you are. I'm asking you to be a part of something bigger, a family." Rachel's breath caught in her throat. Family. The word echoed in her mind, stirring up memories of her own fractured past. The family she had lost, the places she had never belonged. Could she really be a part of this? Could she build a life with Luke and Victor when everything she had known had always been temporary? Her thoughts swirled in a whirlwind of doubt and uncertainty. But one thing was clear. Luke had become more than just a boy she read to in the library. He had become a part of her life, a connection she wasn't willing to sever. And somehow, despite the doubts, she realized that she couldn't walk away from them. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady, though her heart raced. "I'll be part of your world. But not for the wealth, not for the position. For Luke." The moment those words left her mouth, Rachel knew her life was about to change forever. She had just made a decision that would alter everything. A decision that would not only affect her future, but also the future of Luke and Victor. And though the path ahead was uncertain, Rachel knew one thing for sure: she had found a place where she finally belonged.